Keyword: environment. This project situates the keyword environment in a cross-cultural historical context with emphasis on its usage in colonial American history. I aim to catalog indigenous definitions of the concept to make my case that the current ethnocentric usage predominant in policy making today discriminates against alternate paradigms of sustainable development in which human intervention is implicated in environment, not separate from it. This perceived separation is demonstrably relative, as evidenced by numerous eloquent testimonies, such as that of Standing Bears in the Land of the Spotted Eagle, where he testifies that the association of knowledge with all the creatures of the earth caused the Lakota to look to them for knowledge, and, assuming their spiritual fineness to be of the quality of their own, seek with them a true rapport, and which Callicott references in his seminal piece, The Wilderness Idea Revisited, to establish the premise that much well-intentioned environmental policy is based on this genetic, conceptual, culturally relative error and is inadequate to provide solutions. The separation of humans from their environment has been naturalized such that policy decisions gear environmental work toward conservation instead of to successful stewardship. Thanks to the work of researchers like Callicott, however, we have a new paradigm with which to conceptualize the ecological problems faced by the Western European model of development that first falsely assumes the position that man and environment are ontologically separate and distinct, and next asserts this assumption to be absolutely true, not the culturally relative position that it is. This keyword analysis will demonstrate that human technology was intrinsic to the indigenous paradigm of the environment, in which human intervention was a natural affair. Callicott recuperates the social constructionist point of view that systems are based on strategies of attention determined by intention, especially along what is still often construed as the inalienable atomic axes of binaries like man, woman, and humans, nature. But Callicott iconoclastically marries that claim to the claim that not all constructions are equal. As a consequence, environmentalism in its current state is exposed to be hemmed in by an information-poor cultural iron curtain that has left American capitalist culture in a state of benighted dysfunction. Through comparative analysis with cultures who construe the environment as something continuous with the human biology, psychology, spirit, and knowledge base, the term environment becomes something more than its development along one axis of historical time. Cross-cultural variation in usage and application may modify assumptions about what the environment is and isn't that have been naturalized in the Western model, but which are, in fact, relative to the semantics of capitalist culture. An example of a culture whose construction of environment is incommensurate with the definition in play in late American capitalist culture is the Aloha Aina, or Uamauke'ea o Ka'aina I Kapono of Hawaii Nei, which ties ethical action to right, or pono, treatment of the land, or Aina. Also of importance are accounts of relationships with the land prior to and after the period of land enclosures in England, pre- and post-Tudor, which marked a seismic shift in the way natural resources had been stewarded and managed up until that time, as a modern money system was gradually adopted and steps were taken to industrialize the area's resource base and centralize management of it. I am examining here, as Vermonia Alston does in passing, the mainstream preoccupation with wilderness traditions, pastoralism, and the romantic impulse of nature writing as fetishism, but I emphasize the 14th century change in usage that occurs at the time the word nature is replaced with environs, a French word from which the English term environmentalism ultimately derives. Alston attends to Raymond Williams' omission of the term environment in his classic Keywords text by foregrounding Williams' entry on nature, enacting what will be this term's erasure in the first and second editions of the Burgett and Hendler's Keywords for American Cultural Studies, by performing an interview in the absence of the term environment in Williams' book. That the term Williams elides recurs with a vengeance is evident from the noticeable absence of the entry on nature in the first two editions of Burgett and Hendler, where it is subordinated to the term environment. The term environment nonetheless already exists as a premonitory cultural artifact in Raymond Williams' classic Keywords, a vocabulary of culture and society. Here, nature still precedes environment as a classic key word. If the concept of the environment, as Callcott asserts, is a result of Western philosophers of nature becoming enamored of the scientific method, we can discern a snapshot of its usage and inchoate manifestation from 1978, the date of Keywords' publication, by searching for all the entries in which the term science appears, and then also searching for all the entries in which the term nature appears. By cross-referencing them, we get the following list of entries: organic, psychological, cultural, materialism, genetic, ideology, doctrinaire, culture, behavior, determinism. Environment, in other words, emerges as an inchoate index of alienation. The space conventionally observed by natural philosophers to be a living reality coterminal with human consciousness is expunged and effectively converted to property, coincident with the penning of the Novum Organum by Francis Bacon. The Novum Organum was said by Bacon to be a tribute to King James, and in tongue-in-cheek a response to the King James Bible, completed in his lifetime. In it, Bacon posed his challenge to the King James Bible, which he assisted in penning, by asserting that an even greater work of humankind lay ahead, and he sought to demonstrate it through the composition of a treatise structurally analogous to the King James Bible, in which he presented his great work, the scientific method, or new science, or as he called it, the Novum Organum, Latin for the new method. This was his response to the English God, nature, state, and religion into which he was born. What was the scientific method? And considering its introduction into the canon of English thought over a century prior to the American Revolution on the brink of the War of the Three Kingdoms, or English Civil War, what does it have to do with transplanting the environment onto the natural world? The birth of the method and the term coincides with the dawning of global capitalism, the expansion of colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, and the triumph of people over nature. Does this mean anything? How did the environment, with its origins in environs and the imported practice of land enclosure, come to pluck out brains and all from the local inhabitants, as Iago says of himself in Othello, when searching to complement Desdemona, but lacking all invention to contrive one, whilst mentally occupied with secretly plotting her murder? How did the culturally relative concept of the environment resound in the ears of people who saw the term used to service the extermination of their habitat? In the 14th century, environs emerges in Wycliffe's translation of the Bible as an interpretation of the classical Latin circuitous, meaning around. This reveals the logic of enclosure embedded in Anglo-Saxon culture and the promotion of this logic through the writing of the Bible. In its early 13th century Anglo-Norman and Middle French usage, the Oxford English Dictionary most commonly finds environs to signify frontiers, boundaries, circumference, or surroundings. The environment is thus synonymous with the emergence of the English language, and comes into full flower during the High Middle English period of the Plantagenet era, in which preceded the Old English phase of Norman England, shortly antecedent, that is, to the House of Anjou creation of the Magna Carta, which was originally entitled The Great Charter of the Liberties of England and the Liberties of the Forest. Since the Magna Carta will become the model for the legal system upon which colonialism is built, it is significant that its creation historically precipitates the advent of the word environment in the English language. The United States has a colonial history, and English colonists called the new lands of North America and Australia wilderness, an idea taken originally from the English translation of the Bible. This designation enabled them to see the American and Australian continents as essentially empty of human beings and thus available for immediate occupancy. The Australian bureaucratic term for wilderness, terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning empty land, says it all quite explicitly. So does the Wilderness Act of 1964, which defines wilderness as an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence, without permanent improvements or human habitation. So what is our common habitat if nature, by way of the environment, has been defined as a terra nullius, that, with a primeval character untarnished by human habitation, in the founding legislation on which policy is built in America? For a broader perspective, I turn now to the long view provided by Our Common Habitat, a report provided by the World Commission on Environment and Development, written for the United Nations in 1987, in which the substitution of the wilderness concept in place of mutually sustaining relationships between people and their surroundings is complete. In Part 3 of this report, this dissociated alienation is reenacted in its eponymous title, Common Endeavors, Conflict as a Source of Unsustainable Development. The inversion of cause for effect here substitutes conflict as the cause of unsustainable development instead of the more logically intuitive conclusion that unsustainable development causes conflict. The consequence of this sleight of hand is environmental policy, which has failed to provision sustainable outcomes through the management of natural resources. This abysmal state of dysfunction has produced the sustainability movement as a unique entity distinct from the environmental movement. Adam Rome's reflections in 2001 situate the recognition of the dysfunction of this socially constructed notion of the environment to adequately support sustainable systems of human development over the long term at the origins of the sustainability movement, in which he locates the post-war period circa 1959 via reference to a Life magazine article by William White on Levitt's America entitled A Plan to Save a Vanishing U.S. Countryside. The sustainability movement can thus be seen as a natural consequence of the alienation of people from the mutually causal relationship with their habitat that existed prior to the construction of the environment out of the world around them, first during the pre-colonial land enclosures of the Plantagenet period, as documented in the etymological record, and then during its suburbanization under late American capitalist culture as it is chronicled by Lisbeth Cohen in her analysis of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, in which she dissects the confiscation of public infrastructure by military contracted suburban development under the central coordination of the still nascent federal government reconverted for post-war civilian life to restructure society, manufacture consent, and reinforce the authority of the consumer business model of American life. The 1962 Statistical Reporting Service, the United States Department of Agriculture, which discontinued reporting the number of horses and mules on farms because they were no longer significant to farm production, is an index of the impact of post-war policy on the relationship between the average American farmer and the land. Where is the environment in this? Good question. James Howard Kunstler charges and condemns suburban living conditions for the death of the American habitat in The Geography of Nowhere through its replacement with the agoraphobia-producing spectacle that politicians proudly call growth, where 80% of everything ever built in America has been built in the last 50 years, and most of it is depressing, brutal, ugly, unhealthy, and spiritually degrading as the Jive plastic commuter tract home wastelands, the Potemkin village shopping plazas with their vast parking lagoons, the Lego block hotel complexes, the gourmet mansardic junk food joints, the Orwellian office parks, featuring buildings sheathed in the same reflective glass as the sunglasses worn by the chain gang guards, the particle board garden apartments rising up in every meadow and cornfield, the freeway loops around every big and little city with their clusters of discount merchandise marts, the whole destructive, wasteful, toxic, agoraphobia-inducing spectacle that politicians proudly call growth. The roots of this construction of the environment as something opposed to human intervention can be unearthed in colonial American history through the Recorder's Office land administration records from the Gloucester plantation days of the expanding Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1640s. As Daniel Beaver's important study of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's archives from 1642 to 1650 documents, it is increasingly clear that these mundane rights of occupation were joined through the language of charter and treaty to a high political discourse of imperium and dominium, the Roman law terms in which the English crown and its agents justified royal sovereignty over its New World dominions to other European powers during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The published ordinances of the 1642 Gloucester meeting requiring the building of dwelling houses and fencing as marks to confirm possession further delineates the rise of the environs as a staple land policy from the point of view of enclosure. Under the bylaws of colonial Gloucester, property could be lost if not built upon. This politics of property that involved control over the offices that conferred title to land were important not only in the making of property, but to the construction of the environment that will be built upon these precedents of law. The record of these early transactions in the Massachusetts Bay Colony extends back to 1639 in the holdings of the established General Court, which had administered a patent for the fishing plantation on Cape Ann that year on behalf of the London merchant Maurice Thompson. The Recorder's Project in New England began to take shape in 1635, when Obadiah Bruin, the youngest son of John Bruin and Bruin Stapleford in Cheshire, acquired a share in the Piscataqua plantation project as part of a syndicate drawn from the powerful company of drapers in Shrewsbury, to which Obadiah himself belonged. Although the explicit political significance of English corporate and manorial approaches to land law in these settlements have not yet been understood, Bruin's Town Book of the Gloucester Plantation provides a useful point of departure for further study of the quintessentially colonial American construction of land law and the re-scripting of land that had been human habitat to land as property in a system of exchange that benefited the corporate landholders of incorporated bodies, such as the Massachusetts Bay, Virginia, Plymouth, and London companies, at the expense of both the settlers who were used to colonize the region and the indigenous who were colonized or exterminated. The entitlement to possess land expressed an imperial prerogative that imposed a construction on human habitat that put that habitat in the service of the crown or one of its incorporated bodies. The early colonies were such bodies, and it is upon the basis of their tradition of administering the land that land policy is built in the United States. Early Dutch, English, and French-American settlers brought milling technologies from Europe in unison with these administrative traditions, further transforming human habitat in accordance with the capitalist mode of production, supported by the administrative procedures and processes for managing land and resources, of which the records of the General Court of the early Gloucester and Bruin's Town Record compose a 1639 to 1650 period sample. Dam building for water power in the eastern United States began in the late 1600s and persisted until the early 1900s. Dams and races that delivered water from the pond upstream of a dam were built to run iron forges, furnaces, mining operations, and most commonly, mills. We refer to all these water-powered activities as milling. Before the adoption of steam engines during the late 19th century, every mill required a mill dam reservoir to supply a relatively constant head and reliable supply of water. Whig politician John C. Spencer's observation in 1847 that the United States was a boundless hydrographical system was not lost on the Army Corps of Engineers. Created officially in 1802 by the Jefferson administration as a war academy and fort-building agency, it was originally organized in 1779 by an act of Congress, commanded by George Washington and composed mostly of French engineer scholars from the court of Louis XIV. This institution's role in fort building contributed to a rise in the usage of the term environs within the military, as a comparative study of the letters of Revolutionary officers alongside those from the Civil War reveals. This special civilizing influence of property ownership on the indigenous population went hand in hand with the model of scientific imperialism inherited directly from the court of Versailles during the French Indian Wars to rationalize the genocide resulting from their technological advantage over the indigenous population as a side effect of the colonization of natural mineral resources. The core leadership, borrowing chiefly from the French model, favored a planned economy where the army guided construction and science was the methodological tool of a rational, centralized state, and resisted the British example of the self-made builder mechanic in a freewheeling capitalist system. Environs emerges in writings on heraldry, chivalry, courtly behavior, and in connection with the enclosure of property by water, as well as in tributes to the knightly tradition of the French court, and property as it is construed in the round according to this imperial system. The lawns Cohen catalogues as part of Levitt's property post-war America are thus in fact a latter-day expression of the Old English lawns, from the Old French land, which declines over time to become the word land in the English language, thus implicitly expressing that the environment as it is constructed in America is still an extension of the 14th century court, manor, and manorial land law that became a tool for colonialism and helped advance the new order of things through the imperial disregard for any human habitat held in common by people who are not subordinate to a sovereign central authority. The term environment in the context of American studies can thus be seen as a tool for colonizing natural resources and naturalizing a politics based on property as political capital. Under this paradigm, sustainability concerns are the inevitable reaction of a habitat rendered unsustainable due to its subordination to a system of production impervious to its requirements for sustenance. American culture, from the transcendentalism of Walden Pond to the passage of the Environmental Protection Act under Nixon, to Rachel Carson's 1960 countercultural classic Silent Spring, exhibits nostalgia for a habitat from which humans have not been alienated under colonial capitalism, while simultaneously reordering this habitat as an environment where longing for what has been replaced has been neutralized with an impulse to conserve and consume. But Winona LaDuke states simply in her analysis of American environmental issues, a society based on conquest cannot be sustained. Roosevelt's 1930s Civilian Conservation Corps was wildly popular according to the Pittsburgh Press in 1939. John Muir's legacy of conservation policy has ennobled the Sierra Club, the National Park System, and the modern environmental movement. But if the key to sustainability is accountability to natural law, as LaDuke asserts in her discussion in Native Peoples and the Environmental Crisis, then a concept of the environment crafted from land administration policy based on the colonial construction of the natural world as something to be divided up, exchanged, or conserved can only inhibit sustainability. The recent birth of the caricature of the ecologically noble savage expresses the incompatibility of the Euro-American cultural assumptions of conservationist and environmentalism with indigenous culture. If sustainability is to be achieved, the degraded concept of the environment must first be recuperated for a post-colonial culture. This implies stepping outside the constraints of colonial constructions to assume a socioeconomic perspective that recognizes the reciprocity of humans and habitat in continuous inhabitation of place, or, as Winona LaDuke says, recovering the sacred